Hello, welcome to the last history revision video for paper 1. This one is on the Vietnam War. It's the last part of the Cold War section, which you'll find in section 8 of the paper 1 exam. And Vietnam is an example of the Cold War being fought by proxy. That means that the USA and the USSR aren't going to fight each other directly. Instead, they're going to fight each other through other groups of people. Vietnam has a varied and colourful history. It's originally known as French Indochina. In the 19th century, it became a French colony. In 1942, Japan invaded French Indochina. The French were obviously taken up with the Second World War and being invaded by Germany, and so French Indochina was an open target for the Japanese. The Japanese were particularly harsh and cruel to the local Vietnamese people, who launched a resistance campaign led by a communist called Ho Chi Minh. This resistance movement were known as the Viet Minh, and they fought a very fierce guerrilla war against the Japanese, a very successful one. Japan ended up spending a lot more money and resources and men in Indochina than they expected to. Ho Chi Minh wasn't ever strong enough to push the Japanese out of his country, but he did constantly cause them trouble, and crucially for what we are looking at, it gave Ho Chi Minh valuable experience of a guerrilla war. In 1945, the Second World War ended, Japan was defeated, and the Viet Minh were left in control of most of the north of the country. They wanted to control the whole country, and in 1945, Ho Chi Minh entered the capital city of Hanoi and declared independence and renamed the country Vietnam, which literally translates to our people. In 1946, however, the French returned and wanted to reclaim the country as their own and call it Indochina again. Immediately, Viet Minh went to war again with France. In 1949, China had its revolution and became a communist country, and that changes the whole relationship between America and Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh. Prior to this, Vietnam had been supported by America. Ho Chi Minh was seen as an ally in the war against Japan, and most Americans had a certain sense of support for them in wanting to throw over a colonial leader like France. However, once China becomes communist, the domino theory takes over all thinking. The next country to China is Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh is already communist, so the fear is that the dominoes will spread throughout Southeast Asia, communism will spread from China into Vietnam and then throughout Southeast Asia. So immediately American policy changes. Ho Chi Minh goes from being a resistance fighter and hero to being a communist and the enemy, and America supports France in this war. The war goes very badly for the French. It drags on from 1946 to 1954. The French tend to control most of the towns and the cities. The Viet Minh control the countryside. This pattern will be repeated later on when the Americans get involved. The decisive battle of the war is fought at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, when a large, well-armoured French force of paratroopers was comprehensively defeated by the Viet Minh. 3,000 French soldiers were killed and 8,000 were taken prisoner. By this time, the Viet Minh are being supplied with weapons by both China and the USSR. A conference was held at Geneva in 1954 to settle what would happen to the country. The French pulled out. The decision was taken, like with Korea, to split Vietnam into two, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. In North Vietnam, controlled by Ho Chi Minh, the country would be communist. In South Vietnam, the Americans attempted to put into place a democracy there. However, like with most of Eastern Europe, they were afraid that if elections were held in South Vietnam, a communist party might win. They certainly would have the advantage of being Vietnamese, of speaking the language, of being known to people in South Vietnam, and many South Vietnamese would have sympathy with them, and almost certainly the Communist Party would have won. So America banned the elections. America, the great supporters of democracy, banning elections. There's a certain degree of irony there. Instead of elections, America openly supported the new ruler of the Republic of South Vietnam, a particularly unpleasant man called Ngo Dinh Diem, who was wealthy, corrupt and cruel. He treated peasants with contempt and persecuted Buddhists, the majority of the population. But he was anti-communist. So then America backed him with over $1.6 billion of aid. The American Secretary of State, John Dulles, said, "We knew Diem was bad, but we knew of no one better." And this support of a corrupt regime is one of the things that will turn the American public very quickly against the war in Vietnam later on in the 1960s. In December 1960, Ho Chi Minh sets up the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam, or to give its more easily remembered name, the Viet Cong. This is a communist guerrilla army. It's going to go to war. It's, if you like, the Third Vietnam War. As far as Ho Chi Minh's concerned, it's just a continuation of a war he's been fighting since 1942. Now he's fighting South Vietnam. America are committed, so they have to support the South Vietnamese. By now we're into Kennedy as president, and in 1962 he began to send military advisors to South Vietnam. He was already sending money and weapons to South Vietnam, but they were losing the war. So he starts to send military advisors, army officers, American army officers, who will train the Vietnamese troops. They won't fight, but they will train them. In 1964, the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, decided that America was going to have to go further than this, that simply training the troops wasn't going to work, and started to make plans for American troops to go into Vietnam. And on the 8th of March 1965, the first American troops set foot in Vietnam to actually begin fighting. From that point on, American troops are fighting in Vietnam. A common question in the exam, though, is when does America get involved? Or how does America get involved? And you can trace back America's involvement from 1942, when they were supporting Ho Chi Minh against the Japanese, to 1946, when they were supporting him against the French, to 1949, when the Americans switch sides completely and start supporting the French, and then from 1954, they're supporting Ngo Dinh Diem. Once we get into the Vietnamese War, questions in the exam tend to focus on the tactics of both the Americans and the Viet Cong, and the reasons why America ultimately withdrew from the conflict. The Viet Cong is a large force, 170,000 troops, well supplied with weapons from China and the USA, and experts at guerrilla fighting. They've been doing it since 1942. They're well trained at it. They've built a network of underground tunnels throughout the country. They're highly skilled. They fight without uniforms. They hit and run. They ambush. They're also very good at getting the support of the local population. They were much better at winning hearts and minds than the Americans were. The Viet Cong would turn up in local villages and help with harvest. They would support people in need. They would support victims of bombing. They would also threaten and intimidate the local population. If the South Vietnamese supported the Americans in any way, they would become targets. For the Americans, their policy in Vietnam is a difficult one. It's a war that they're always going to find difficult to win. They initially are sending over drafted troops, conscripts, people that don't really want to be there. It's a difficult place to fight in. They're fighting the geography of Vietnam. It's jungle, it's mountainous, it's not particularly well mapped. The jungle canopy is very thick, so air support is difficult. It's difficult to spot what's happening on the ground from the air. There are no reliable maps because the vegetation grows so quickly. The Viet Cong know the jungle, they've lived in it all their lives, and they know where the tunnels and the traps and the trails are. The Americans don't have a clue. They're fighting the climate. It's very hot, it's very humid. There are insects that are going to bite you all the time. There are diseases that the Americans have no immunity to. So it's a very alien world and a very alien landscape that the Americans are trying to fight in. And they're fighting a very skilled guerrilla warfare enemy who, in terms of the psychological impact, are hugely skilled. And many Americans find this an incredibly difficult terrain and place to fight a war in. The Americans decided on various tactics. They tried bombing. They began Operation Rolling Thunder in February 1965, which is extensive bombing by air of military and industrial targets in North Vietnam. It does have some success, but it's extremely expensive and very slow. It was estimated in 1972 that it cost over $400,000 American for every one Viet Cong soldier that was killed. They tried chemical weapons to try and negate the influence of the jungle. So they dropped Agent Orange, a toxic weed killer, which destroyed the jungle, but will also destroy innocent civilians. It will also poison their fields. It will poison their water supply. The people of Vietnam are farmers. You start poisoning their land, their water supply, you're going to lose their support. They also tried napalm, which is a gel-like substance which ignites when dropped on jungles. As soon as it meets moisture, it bursts into flame. It'll burn through anything, including skin and bone. And again, it's not going to win many fans. It's also seen as cruel. American public don't like seeing these type of weapons. It's not the things that Americans are comfortable with their soldiers using. They came up with search and destroy, which, if in a way, is the old tactic of building fortresses. They build a fort, they equip it, they defend it, they then send troops out by helicopter to targets, drop into the jungle, hit fast, fly out again. It relies entirely upon information. If the information's good, it works. If the information's bad, you get horrible mistakes like My Lai. It also doesn't do anything for winning over hearts and minds. The local people never see Americans except when they're jumping out of helicopters, guns blazing. So popular support from the South Vietnamese was always with the Viet Cong, which has a demoralising effect on American soldiers. Thousands of miles away from home, many of them fighting a war they didn't volunteer for, they don't understand, and fighting to defend a people who don't like them. No wonder many American soldiers turn to alcohol, they turn to drugs. And we're in Southeast Asia. We're in a country that grows heroin and cannabis and cocaine and openly supplies it to American soldiers. The war becomes very unpopular in America very quickly. It's televised. An anti-war movement begins very quickly, led by university students. And increasingly the press turn against the war in Vietnam. The My Lai massacre of March 1968, when a unit of American soldiers murdered over 400 women and children and shot them in a ditch, just ruins public support, which is failing anyway. And to many Americans, this becomes a war that they don't want anything to do with. Even when they do well at the Tet Offensive, it's seen as a failure, it's seen as a defeat. We're running out of time, so you're going to have to go and look at notes to get the rest of the details on the Vietnam War. And I will perhaps post another video just to finish all this off and round it off later. Thank you very much for watching.